what Farage really wants to do is he wants to shape right-wing politics. Now, he could either have done that working for Donald Trump in some capacity on his campaign and ultimately his presidency in the White House, or he can do that here in Britain.
It's his eighth attempt to be elected. Having said just last week, remember this, he wouldn't be standing and instead said he'd campaign heavily for Donald Trump. Well, quite a lot's changed since then. The former president's been convicted as a criminal. And Farage says he wants to spice up the campaign. Here. Well, by how much will he do that? And to what extent will this announcement really make life for the Conservatives far more difficult? The Conservatives today have got a plan to curb migration, but will that make much of a difference? Here to talk us through it all is Theo Usherwood, political correspondent. Theo, good morning.
Very good morning to you, Rosie.
How sort of sombre do you think the mood is right now in Conservative Party headquarters?
I think it's very low. That's to be expected. Of course, there had been some relief originally that Nigel Farage wasn't going to stand in this general election. As you rightly said, he wanted to concentrate on what was happening in America with the election of Donald Trump, potentially in November as president against Joe Biden. But of course, last Friday we saw the conviction of Donald Trump. He could still well stand in the presidential election at the beginning of November, but his chances have become significantly reduced because, of course, following those 34 guilty verdicts, he could very well be in prison. And Nigel Farage is not one to miss out, is he? And therefore, he decided to put his name in the ring for, and the nominations, of course, closed today, for the seat of Clacton, which is one of those areas. It's actually a lovely town, but it's one of those left behind towns right out on the Essex coast, which of course Douglas Carswell won for UKIP when he defected to the party from the Conservatives during a by-election back in 2014. So for Nigel Farage, it is an eminently winnable seat. And the other thing I think was really important to mention is that we saw Farage in the last few days increasingly left out. He wanted to take part in the debate, but it was an effective line, wasn't it, from his opponents, people like the Prime Minister or Conservatives, saying, actually, you want to stand in this election, that's all very well, but you're not putting your name forward for a seat. So your voice in this election, I think it's fair to say we can ignore it because you're not putting yourself up for a vote. And that criticism stung. And for all his faults, Nigel Farage does, Rosie, have an element, quite a strong sense of self-awareness, and he knows when he's on a losing wicket with a particular argument. And he realised quite quickly he wasn't going to be able to have the impact unless he stood in this election.
And he wants to have an impact. I mean, love him or loathe him, he has huge charisma. And in part, that's why he's been effective in many ways. Why does this particularly pose such a big problem to the Conservatives? We heard there a little bit from Tim Montgomery's analysis saying, you know, the one benefit for Rishi Sunak of calling the election now is that Farage would have been otherwise occupied. Why does he wield so much sort of influence and power that causes concern for the Conservatives?
So without Nigel Farage, Reform UK could probably poll 2, maybe 3% at the outset, and those are votes that would otherwise go to the Conservative Party. With Farage taking part, giving it everything, and if he can push that Reform vote up to 5 or 6%, then that is suddenly going to bring into play seats for the Labour Party that it would otherwise not hope to win, because those are votes that are not going to the Conservative. And that will amount in, most seats, that will amount to several hundred, if not a couple of thousand votes. And that's why Nigel Farage is so, as you said, they'll be hanging their heads in disbelief, and in shock in Conservative headquarters, because that's the Nigel Farage effect. Now, of course, we've already seen the Tories come out and they've said, a vote for Nigel Farage is a vote for Keir Starmer, and this is often an attack line used when a political party will say, actually, you're not. If you vote for this protest vote, then you're only going to end up with the person that you really don't want. Why not stay safe and vote with me? Or this is the Prime Minister speaking. Yeah, where you can decide who's going to be Prime Minister. It's either Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. But interestingly, if you listen to what Farage said yesterday, he's already trying to spike the guns of that argument, Rosie, by saying, listen, this election's done and forget the result. Keir Starmer's won, and of course he timed it quite well, perhaps fortuitously, with that mega MRP poll which came out yesterday, which gave Labour a majority of just shy of
Well,
200,
yeah, I mean, the poll
only
came
the
out
majority
just
of 1907.
an hour after Nigel Farage made this announcement. To kind of give you the top line, this was 50,000 people said Labour was on track for its biggest election victory in history, surpassing what Tony Blair managed to do in 97, predicting that Keir Starmer could win 422 seats. Now, Theo, this obviously before the news we've just been talking about. I mean, this is
But
it's significant.
it only backs up Farage's argument, doesn't it? That this
Mm,
election is over, that it's going to be, and it may not be over. Let's just be fair. This is a one poll, and the only poll that matters, and this is really important to say. The only poll that matters is, of course, the vote on polling day on July the 4th. But it does back up Nigel Farage's argument that, given the size of the majority we're talking about here for Labour being predicted, and it is only a prediction, that Keir Starmer is realistically going to be the only man who can become Prime Minister on July the 5th. And that's important because you'll hear much more, I'm sure, from Rishi Sunak in the next and his supporters in the coming days and weeks, that a vote for Farage is a vote for Starmer. But Farage is saying, listen, you might as well vote for me with your protest vote. And there's a wider point as well, because what Farage really wants to do is he wants to shape right-wing politics. Now, he could either have done that working for Donald Trump in some capacity on his campaign and ultimately his presidency in the White House, or he can do that here in Britain. But it is a chance. He is taking a chance. He's a serial loser when it comes to general elections. He's stood 7 times and he's not won one of those. And he'll in order for this to pull this off, he does need to get elected to the seat of Clacton. Now, if he can do that, he could enter Parliament as one of a handful, maybe even just the sole Reform UK MP, and then what you will see is Nigel Farage in Parliament, and there will be the Tories in opposition, and of course there will be many of the One Nation caucus of Tories left. When you're looking at that, depending on how many Conservatives are left within that opposition, there will be a significant caucus of One Nation Conservative MPs, as well as those of the right of the Conservative Party who might be tempted to adopt Mr. Farage into the Conservative Party, or indeed defect to Reform UK. But he will be able to shape right-wing politics into his own mold as being more to the right and more to the right than perhaps than the Tories would otherwise wish to go if he is elected. But it is a gamble because the system is set up in a way that makes it quite difficult for Mr. Farage to get Reform elected, and he will be stretched very thin. You'll remember back in 2015, he stood down in Thanet, and UKIP were based up in London, and he ran this campaign down in Thanet, which he ultimately lost. UKIP became more and more disjointed, and there is a chance, actually, in fairness to the Tories, that you could see Nigel Farage almost become a little bit isolated, trying desperately to win that seat over in Clacton. The media not necessarily being up for going all the way to Clacton every time Nigel Farage is having a press conference, and at the same time, Reform in London not being in London and able to land the punches with the big press conferences and press calls to which you can get everybody or persuade everybody to easily turn up to. So there is a risk that Nigel Farage, with this announcement, just to offer some caution to all the furore, actually spreads himself too thin and can't quite manage what he's trying to achieve.
Theo, thank you so much. Theo Usherwood, the political correspondent on Farage's return. Having decided last week he wasn't going to run, as you well know, he's changed his mind. He's going to be standing in Clacton. There'll be more on that at 12 o'clock today. But just to tell you the other candidates standing in that seat that we know of so far. Matthew Bellingham for the Liberal Democrats, Nigel Farage, of course, for Reform UK, Natasha Obeson for the Green Party, Jovan Owosunipul for the Labour Party, and Giles Watling for the Conservatives.